Good luck.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our ninth session of the Civics Virtual Series. Of course, I'm Maria, and I'm joined by my colleagues Erica and Andrea, and we have two special guests today. We have Tibby and Michael, who will talk to us all about Google Podcasting. So thanks so much for joining. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes to pop on here, and we'll get started in about 3 or 4 minutes. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I am so excited to present our podcaster playbook today. So thanks so much for just make sure that if you have any questions, make sure to put them right down below. There's a blue button that says ask a question. So feel free to throughout the entire live stream. Make sure you tune in, ask any questions that you want, and we'll get to those at the end. But like I said, today we're going to talk about podcasting. I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Andrea, and also our two special guests, Michael and Tibby, who are going to talk to us all about podcasting. So if you have a podcast now, or if you're looking to start one, this is a great session for you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael and we'll get started.
Thanks, Maria. We're really excited to share what we call the Podcaster Playbook with you folks today. This is a resource that we've developed to help podcasters and potential podcasters better understand the ins and outs of podcasting. But before we dive in, I'd love to kick it off with some quick introductions. So my name's Michael. I work on the Google Podcast team. We build products both for podcast listeners and for podcast creators. So our team doesn't actually create podcast shows ourselves, but we work really closely with podcasters and across our team have a lot of knowledge of the podcast ecosystem that we are super excited to share with y'all today. And then I'll hand it off to Tibby as well.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, guys. I'm Tibby I'm a marketer that sits on the Think with Google team. Think with Google at Google, it's our marketing thought leadership publication. So think consumer behavior, media, spend information, consumer trends, that kind of thing. It's a free resource. Anyone can actually go right now to thinkwithgoogle.com and you can check out any of that stuff if it's interesting. But the reason I'm joining today is because this thought leadership publication, Think with Google, we have a site, we have a newsletter, but recently I launched our new podcast because we wanted to bring that interesting thought leadership to the world in this exciting channel. So I know the ins and outs of building a podcast from the ground up. So I will be jumping in to talk a little bit about best practices when it comes to actual production. So looking forward to it.
Cool. So between Tibby and I, these are the three topics that we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. We'll start off by giving a quick overview of the podcast landscape, how it's grown over the last few years, and what are some of the things about podcasting that make it unique. Then second, I will do a deep dive on Google Podcasts, what our products are, sort of how we think about what makes them unique, and how podcasters can get the most out of them. And then third, Tibby will jump back in and share some of her experience in starting the Think with Google podcast and talk through some best practices about what it takes to launch a successful podcast. And before I dive in, I think, Maria asked us to speak about this to y'all today, I think for a number of reasons, but one of them is that we've seen recently that podcasting has become increasingly popular in the political space. I think podcasts that are focused on politics have been popular for a while, but in the last couple years, we've actually seen more and more politicians themselves or other thought leaders in the political space launch their own podcasts, whether it's Ted Cruz or Joe Biden, to name some of the more popular ones. And so we thought it would be kind of a particularly relevant content for this audience because we know that some of you may have recently launched a podcast and are sort of learning about how to take it to the next level, or some of you are considering, is a podcast the right thing for me and the politician that I work with or the organization that I'm a part of. So we hope that we can shed a little bit of light on those questions today. So to dig into the podcast landscape, I think it's helpful to frame the podcasting opportunity by talking about the incumbent audio medium, and that is radio. And radio is huge. It's actually the largest distribution technology ever created. You can see here how it stacks up against TV, smartphones, and PCs. And right now, radio is reaching over 90% of the US every week, and over 3 billion people worldwide. And it's been incredibly durable, right? Like you would have thought that the internet has been around for a while, radio would be less popular, but it continues to be incredibly popular both in the US and around the world. And we don't think it's going away anytime soon. Like it's been this durable, but you can kind of imagine some of the reasons why it's not an ideal medium. right? It's not personalized for you. It's not on demand, right? When you turn on the radio, you're kind of dropped midstream into whatever is happening. And then you're also fairly limited in terms of selection. If you turn on the radio, there's maybe a few dozen channels. When you think about the world of podcasting or other types of digital content, there's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces of content out there that you could potentially consume. And so I think, those are some of the limitations of radio, and there's a huge opportunity in podcasting because podcasting sort of solves some of those problems, right? As I mentioned, there's a ton of podcasts out there. There's different estimates, but certainly in the millions of shows. It's also on demand, right? You can queue it up and listen whenever is most convenient to you. And it's beginning to be increasingly tailored for you. And this is something that I'll talk a little bit about on the Google Podcast side and sort of what we're doing there. This is a chart that shows podcast growth over the last 7 years or so in the US. And this kind of just underscores how quickly the popularity of podcasts has increased. Today in the US, about a quarter of people listen to podcasts weekly and almost 40% listen monthly. And I think even more impressive than sort of the raw numbers is the growth rate. And so you can see on this chart over the last 7 years, it's roughly tripled in size in terms of the number of people in the US who are listening every week. And the reasons for this growth are numerous. Like I mentioned some of them already. It's on demand. There's a lot of shows. It's increasingly becoming personalized. But I think there's still lots of gaps and opportunities for folks. On the content side, there are lots of shows, as I mentioned, but there's still a lot of opportunity for breakout hits. One of the most popular, or actually I think the most popular podcast is The Daily by the New York Times. And that was launched only about 3 years ago. And we've seen other news brands like the Wall Street Journal kind of get into the space in the last year or so as well. And news is a massive category, but there's still new podcasts that are really breaking through to listeners. And then on the product side, and this is something that I mentioned Google's been working on, we've been trying to take a crack at the problem of how do we make it easier for people to discover podcasts that they love. There's millions of shows out there, and there's a handful of podcasts that many people are familiar with. But how do we help connect you to the show that maybe only has 5,000 listeners, but is actually really interesting based off of what you're interested in? And so that's something that we on the product side of Google Podcasts have been thinking deeply about. And as podcasting continues to grow, it's worth noting that podcast listeners are incredibly engaged and loyal. And so just to run through some of these stats here, because I think they're really interesting. 7 is the number of podcasts that's consumed by the average weekly listener. And 93% listen to all or most of each podcast episode, which is really kind of crazy when you situate that in the context of this digital environment that we're in right now. People have short attention spans. They're scrolling through the internet on their feeds, sort of looking at a piece of content for maybe a few seconds if you're lucky. Podcast is really different. When people engage with podcasts, they tend to do it in a really thoughtful, sort of deeply engaged way. And not surprisingly, because of that deep engagement, this third stat, 54% are more likely to consider brands that advertise on podcasts. And so I know this audience isn't necessarily thinking from the perspective of advertising, but I think it is a good sort of signal that podcast is a medium that can help your message, whatever it is, break through to your audience. So that's just a little bit about sort of the podcast ecosystem, how it's grown over the last few years, and really just kind of framing why we think podcasts is important and why many of you might be interested in podcasting yourselves. And so now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what we're doing on Google Podcasts, because I think we've been doing a lot of really interesting work, both from the listener side, providing products and tools for folks who are interested in listening to podcasts, but also on the creator side, which I know is more relevant to this audience. We actually just launched a new tool yesterday, which I'll talk about, that can kind of help you better understand your listeners and your audience. And so a little bit of background on Google Podcasts. It was launched in June 2018, so about 2 years ago. And Google Podcasts is our dedicated podcast player. So you can access it on your Android phone, on your iPhone. You can also access it on the web. And you can use Google Podcasts to access millions of shows, stream them, download them for offline listening. Anything, really anything to kind of engage with the many shows that are out there. And currently, we're the most popular podcast app on Android with millions of listeners in the US and around the world. And we actually went through a recent redesign of Google Podcasts where we updated sort of the functionality in the app and with a real focus on helping people discover podcasts that they love. And I mentioned this earlier, that this is kind of a theme for us on Google Podcasts. But if you download the Google Podcasts app and you click over to the second tab, which we call the Explore tab, you can actually see a set of personalized recommendations, both shows and episodes, based off of your listening history. And this is an attempt to sort of provide listeners with shows that they might not have found otherwise, but are going to be really interesting and potentially useful for them. And so in addition to that, users can also browse through the various topics in the Explore tab, so they can dive into shows in history, in news, in politics, in entertainment, and sort of browse shows there and subscribe to them and sort of listen in more of an ongoing basis. So this is just a little bit about Google Podcasts. Again, this is really our listener, consumer-facing product. And I encourage, if you all haven't tried it out, definitely download it on your phone, or it's great, especially since so many people are working from home these days. The web version is really great as well, and you can access that at podcast.google.com. Google Podcast Manager is our tool for podcast creators, and it's great timing that we're having this webinar today because we actually just launched this tool publicly yesterday. And so I'll talk a little bit about Google Podcast Manager in more detail later in the presentation. But at a high level, what it is it's a tool for podcast creators to sign up and make sure that their show is available on Google Podcasts to all of our listeners, and then also get analytics to better understand at the show and the episode level how their audience is engaging with their podcast. And so again, I'll give more detail there, but wanted to just preview that this is something that from our side is brand new. And then finally, sort of the third leg to the stool for Google Podcasts is what we call the Google Podcast Creator Program. And this launched in the fall of 2018. And the mission of this program is to increase the diversity of voices in the podcast industry globally and lower barriers to podcasting. This is a program that we do in partnership with PRX, which is a large radio and podcast producer. And the core of the program is really a training program. So we solicit applications from independent podcasters from across the world who apply, and if they're admitted into the program, they get sort of regular intensive training from the folks at PRX. And this kind of helps bring them from aspiring podcasters to really big time folks who can produce a professional level show and kind of build their own brand around that. And so this is a really exciting and for me personally, like a really rewarding part of the work to help kind of work with these diverse creators from around the world and kind of see their growth and see them really learn the nuts and bolts of podcasting. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tibby, who is going to talk in a little bit more detail about how to actually start a podcast based off of her experience at Think with Google.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to walk you guys all through kind of the soup to nuts things that you need to consider when you're thinking about starting a podcast. And throughout the presentation, I might be referring to it as a branded podcast. I refer to it that way because on the marketing side, obviously what you're creating is led by and associated with the brand. but I would apply that to your situation as it relates to a person's campaign or a policy measure or a party that you're representing. Essentially, it is a brand that you are trying to communicate or get across. So that's kind of like how I'm thinking about sharing all of this information through that lens. Great. So first things first, if there are if you take away 3 things from this whole presentation about what you need to successfully execute a good podcast in support of whatever message or thing that you're trying to promote. Those 3 things are, you need good audio and production quality. It needs to sound good so that it has that layer of credibility. If it is a format that requires a host, that host needs to be great. They're usually kind of the anchor of the whole thing. And then you need some sort of amplification or marketing budget. And honestly, it might not even necessarily be a huge budget per se of cash. Depending on your resources, it really could just be databases or other communication channels that you have access to. You just have to make sure that there's some lever you can pull to make sure that you get the word out. So we'll start by talking budget. So your budget is going to determine a lot of factors for your podcast. It usually determines your format because certain formats are really easy to execute and some are just like super in depth and require a lot of expertise and time and resources. So we'll talk a little bit about that after this slide. But that's just one of the many things that your budget might dictate, as well as whether or not you can work with a production partner or kind of just resource from your own team. And then sort of level and type of ways to amplify or market that podcast. We don't really put dollar amounts in these buckets because it really depends, on what your team or your initiative sees as low to mid or high budgets. But we will say that a no budget podcast is something that we might caution against, but it doesn't really require much. I think you would really just need enough to get some decent equipment, and you can honestly get some fantastic equipment on Amazon for very little. And then some sort of lever you can pull in order to market the podcast, just to make the juice worth the squeeze and make sure that you're really getting people's ears on it. So that's why we say no budget, I would avoid, but with very, very little, you can actually achieve a lot. I mean, some of the most successful podcasts out there were started by a person with a microphone in their living room. So, it's really to varying degrees. Low budget. So you've got your equipment, you have some resources, that you'll be able to amplify in some way. We would say if you're working kind of scrappily, like you purchase the equipment, you have people on your team executing this. The formats that really work for this are an interview style or repurposing existing audio content that you may already have. Those are kind of easy formats that you can kind of easily execute with very little budget. If you start to get to the medium or high budget, that unlocks a few areas for you. You can start telling deeper stories with like a larger production value, more music, more cutting, kind of more of a deeper story and scripted narrative, and as well as unlock maybe some more opportunities from sort of an amplification standpoint. So like a full kind of in-depth media plan. So those are just kind of the permutations we think of when we think of how we can execute. So to talk a little bit more about formats, there are a ton of different formats. I mean, there are even people executing like full scripted kind of fiction-like series. I don't think that's relevant for us here. I link out to a list in the slide that covers a lot of different formats. But for the purposes of a podcast that's really trying to get the word out about something specific, I pulled 3 here that I think are most relevant. First, we have repurposed content. So this is anything you might have from town halls, candidate speeches, basically anything where you have some good quality audio that you think is really interesting and compelling and doesn't necessarily require that someone, look at it, obviously, because it's an audio medium. So the pros for this are that it's very easy to execute. You already have it. Cons are, of course, you just have to make sure that the audio that you have is compelling for this format, that it was recorded with a crisp sound and that it's compelling to listen to in an audio format. Interview style, that can be a host or multiple hosts interviewing a guest or multiple guests. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to execute. Get the folks in a quiet room, set up that equipment, and you usually with minimal editing afterwards for kind of audio cleanup, maybe some music added, you've got yourself a podcast episode. So that's a great pro. It's fast. It's usually on the cheaper side. From a con perspective, it's obviously really highly dependent on really compelling hosts and guests. So you have to make sure that that interview, is really dynamic. It's really bright and interesting and doesn't lean too dry. Finally, there's what we call kind of the journalistic style or reported in-depth style format. If you're familiar with podcasts, this one's along the lines of Freakonomics or Radio Lab or This American Life, where they're really telling a huge kind of package story. In TV, 60 Minutes is kind of a good example of this. It's just that sort of like package segment style. The pros for this is it's really compelling. It's obviously going to do such a good job of sort of educating on those kind of deeper or more complex messages that you want to sort of get out there. The cons is it's time and budget intensive. So you're going to have to make sure that even if you can't work with a production vendor who has strong expertise in this, that you have people on your team or in your office who feel confident as multimedia producers to be able to execute. I've spoken a little bit about production partners. So this is also very budget dependent. As I mentioned, you can execute a lot of really compelling podcasts without a production partner. If you were to work with a production partner or vendor, these are kind of the main types that we've seen explored, at least on the Google side. So one is just production only, and these can be really scrappy, like you just hire a freelancer and they can oftentimes do a lot for very little, but it can go all the way up to like a really premium full house service. And they just kind of do production only. The pros for this is they're going to be just deep experts in that production element. The cons is that it might be less bang for your buck than the next production type that I'm actually talking about, which is the more media first partnership. So if you do have the funds to have like a robust media support for your podcast, you can work with media vendors who have both production expertise and as part of your contract with them, sort of that media amplification part of it. This is going to have a lot of efficiencies, but only if you have a lot of budget. And also sometimes I worry that, they're going to be so media focused that they might not be as focused in on just producing a really excellent product. So it's just kind of something to keep in mind and something to vet if you were to go with that route. And then finally, a publisher. So as Michael mentioned, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, a lot of publications are executing their own podcasts. They're also doing it for brand partnerships. This has a lot of built-in cachet and name brand associated, but on the con side, it also has name brand associated, so you kind of want to make sure that that's something that you would feel comfortable with. They also can be quite expensive. So just a good lay of the land, but again, you don't need to work with anyone. If you have one person and a mic and, a really interesting story, that's very easy to do too. So here are just some show concepting things to kind of like a checklist to go through. I won't go deeply into each question, but these are just areas you want to explore. If you know that you want a podcast and you know roughly what you want it to be about, it's important to take the time to just think more deeply on these three areas, which are, what does success look like? What are you trying to communicate with this podcast? Is it to go deeper on things that you can't talk about in some of your other comm strategies? Is it to reach an audience that you won't normally reach? Those are great questions to think about. And then when you think about that audience, what do you want? What do they want to listen to from your research? And what is it that you want to communicate to them? And then finally, tone. Is there another podcast or show or book that achieves this, goal tone, like this area of success, this audience? Is there an existing example that achieves those things? And, how can you use that as like a great beacon to sort of guide your production process? And also to see what could be avoided. I think it's always important. It's just as important to ask yourself the question, what do I not want to communicate, or what do I want to avoid? Like, do I make sure it's not too playful? Those are just as important as what does success look like what is my tone? So yeah, I think that a lot of these questions you can kind of brainstorm yourself as well. Like, it doesn't have to be this list here, but it does take the time to not just be like, we should create a podcast because we're trying to get X message across, really unpack that and really kind of get down to the nitty gritty of what you want to communicate. So that's show concepting. For episode concepting, there are some interesting frameworks you can explore. One that we found to be extremely helpful is a 3-part, which is someone does something because, but. So this is like a great framing for how to tell like a full story in your episode. So an example we have here is on the branded side, but let's say a major CPG company needs to change their online marketing strategy. So that's the someone does something because their brand engagement hit an all-time low. But to successfully do that, they had to abandon a lot of tactics that they were already exploring. So you can kind of see how, someone does something because, but kind of really can craft your story very quickly. But some other things to make sure that you kind of include in an episode are, getting those specifics, getting those details. That's really important for a good story. Setting the stage with scenes, making sure it's grounded in like moments and like real-time human exchanges. Good talkers, really important, compelling guests. Changes, it's important that this story has some sort of change, either in the storytelling itself, or if it were an interview, kind of what maybe a takeaway might be. And motivation, which kind of goes into all of the above, like what were the stakes here? What's the tension? What kind of drives this story? So this is a quick slide about how to handle production in-house, so without a partner. The best case scenario for like really great sound quality is to record the host or hosts and interviewees in the same studio. And you can rent a lot of studios. So that's not too prohibitive. You can also, for almost the exact same level of audio quality, you can record people with really, with that equipment we talked about that you can order on Amazon. You can go and send someone to record that conversation in, a quiet room. You can even have the two kind of participants in separate rooms across the country, across the world, as long as they each kind of are on the phone talking to each other, but speaking into, a decent recording device. That actually, we recorded a lot of our podcast that way, and it sounded like they were in the room with each other. And then if you can't send sort of people like producers to do that, you can ship equipment to people. And that, again, kind of produces the same really great quality. And then finally, you can record via phone call. There are ways to do that. I won't go into too much technical detail. If you record someone through the phone with those capabilities, it will sound like they're on the phone, which isn't prohibitive, but just kind of that's sort of the last case. And our last episode of our last season actually had to record amidst the coronavirus situation. And so we had to record people that way, and it sounded fine. Finally, just a note at the bottom there, post-production cleanup. There's going to be ambient noises in the background. There might be some words that might need to be cut. Even if you're not working with a production partner, sometimes you might be able to contract someone for a minimal amount of money to do some of that stuff in post. Or if you're working with someone internally on your team or in your office who has some kind of production expertise, they can do that with tools that they can, find and buy. And so this is just an example of that production process. Won't go into too much detail here just because this is kind of an example, but it's just meant to give you sort of a flavor of what development typically looks like. The beginning is that story search. What are our main things that we want to get out into the world? From there, you craft it into episode pitches. So using some of that sort of tension storytelling techniques that I talked about earlier. This whole production schedule here kind of includes feedback rounds, which, for your purposes, if you have folks on your team or in your office who are like on running the day-to-day execution of all of this, they may need to kind of, bring those episode pitches or bring those rough cut records to maybe like whoever your comms lead is or, other stakeholders within your group, just so that you can kind of loop in those sort of higher up key people, stakeholders to give their feedback throughout. So you kind of do that back and forth between episode pitch, rough cut, revised scripts, and then final scripts, and then of course, publish and distribution. Some best practices on host selection. So The main point here, and this is not surprising, but you obviously want to make sure that you anchor your show, if it is host-led, by a host who has a lot of presence, both on the mic as well as in interviews, just to make sure that you kind of coax that answer out of guests as best you can and as dynamically you can. All of the host things ring true here: charisma, curiosity, experience, of course, subject matter expertise. Those are all kind of great checklists for finding a good host. But the main thing I wanted to point out here is, internal versus external hosts. So for Google, that means, a Googler, like a person who works at Google, or someone from the outside. But for your purposes, it could be anyone from your actual sort of, candidate or official that you support or whose team you're on, or maybe it's, someone on the comms team, or it's some other subject matter expert within your team or within your firm. Basically someone who kind of can give that insider perspective. The pros of this are insider perspective, expertise, a sense of control as well. They're obviously in it with you, so they're going to be as careful with kind of the messaging as you would want them to be. An external host, hiring someone like, say, a journalist, can have its benefits because it adds a lot of credibility to the subject matter. It feels like less maybe, we would say salesy, but kind of insert your word here. So that can kind of make it feel kind of exciting. But at the same time, you can't guarantee that a journalist might not have in the past or in the future say something contradictory to the things that maybe you're wanting to say. So it's just something to keep in mind. Next is best practices on music. In this slide, I talk a lot about how if you work with a partner, they usually will, and this could be even if you did your whole thing yourselves, but maybe you did contract a music partner, this would still hold true. You'll do kind of an exploratory, going over the tone you want to capture, and they'll read scripts and kind of story pitches and all of that stuff so they can get a flavor. And then there's just going to be that back and forth. They're going to send you sound clips. You're going to say, this part sounds great. This part sounds too playful. This part sounds too somber. From there, they'll go and they'll come back and they'll kind of create something net new for you that can really be like the true theme song and mnemonic for your show, and thus for whatever message or candidate you're trying to get the word out about. But if you're on a limited budget, there are lots of stock music options out there for, minimum amounts. So it does run the spectrum here, as a lot of the other things I'm covering do. Next is cover art, which it's similar if you're working with a partner or if you have a creative team internally. This follows a lot of those kind of best practices for developing any sort of piece of sort of creative or comms or messaging. You want to make sure that what you do is you want to use the things that really tie closest back to the rest of your initiative or firm or office or whatever it is, like that sort of like governing body is that this podcast is kind of coming out of. You want to make that tie back. So for us, for Think with Google, I use us as an example here. Our Think with Google logo, we wanted that to be the highlight because we already had the logo. So it's really about making sure that you kind of make that drawback so that those communication efforts you're using the podcast for really do kind of get attributed to, your sort of original sort of message. But then from there, also to create anything around it, what's marketable, connected to the story and the theme of your podcast. Also make sure it sets it apart from the other ones. So one of the reasons why we went sort of with that build from white here is because a lot of the podcast cover arts can be darker. A lot of the podcast channels can be darker. So it might be nice to see kind of what the other art is out there and see what kind of makes yours stand out. Next is about publishing. So basically, how do you get these podcasts across all of the places where people listen? So first, what we would recommend best practices is to publish across all of the major ones so that you get as much listenership as possible. So that's Google Podcasts, of course, as well as Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. And then, depending on, maybe like other markets, you can kind of research to see if there are other, specific audiences. I would do a little bit of research to see if maybe your audience or this theme kind of has some other sort of podcast home that seems especially popular. So another best practice, though, in addition to publishing on those channels, is to create a landing page, some sort of website or a tab on your existing website that sort of promotes the podcast, as well as links out to all of those different channels. And then if you're amplifying with media, sometimes it's best to send people to that landing page versus directly to the podcast channel, because everyone kind of has their own channel/app where they listen the most. So if you're using media to send people to one particular channel, and that person doesn't listen with that particular channel, maybe you would get like a higher, bounce rate than if you send them to a place where they have a menu and they can choose. And as for how to actually put it on these channels, honestly, there's just a long list of different podcast hosting services. Some are free, many are very, very inexpensive. And it's not difficult. Most of them are really turnkey. Like, it kind of walks you through it step by step. So a lot of people think that this part is going to be the hardest. It's usually kind of the easiest part of your process. Just note that there's usually a lag time between when you first kind of upload a show to when it gets approved for publishing. So I wouldn't do it like the day before your show launches, because there might be a lag time after that. And then amplification. So we talk about this in 3 ways, really: paid, owned, and earned. I bet a lot of you talk about it very, very similarly. I'll talk about paid on the next slide. But from an owned perspective, leverage existing channels that you have. You probably have a lot of existing databases, newsletter databases. Maybe you have other parties or collaborators who have their own channels like that you can kind of cross promote with. I have a feeling that if you were to just leverage kind of your existing channels, for many of you, that would reach a lot of people. And that's such a great place to start. And then, of course, from an earned perspective, obviously working with your comms team to drive activation through PR. Another fun trick is, since this is going to be kind of your own podcast and you might not start with advertisers, or maybe you never want to have advertisers. For us, we didn't, because it was branded. So we kind of wanted it to remain thoroughly ourselves. You can create your own mid-roll, those ads that you hear pre or mid-roll in your podcast, and you can have people go to something else. Like for example, maybe your episode is about a particular issue. You can have your mid-roll have a call to action asking people to go to a certain website to sign a petition or to register for something. So there's a lot of like real estate within your own episodes that you can use to kind of support your other initiatives or other partner podcasts, and you can kind of quid pro quo that way. And then from a media perspective, this is really just kind of a super high level. I think there are, many different media channels that you can use. But I will say that the ones that feel kind of most native to a true podcast listener are usually audio ads on related podcasts, and then in-app ads on app like podcast channels. So you would maybe go onto a podcast channel where someone, prefers to listen to theirs, and they have like ad units that you could buy there. Those two are just good just because it's like super intuitive to a podcast listener's like normal everyday behavior. But you can honestly use social, display. I mean, really all of the levers that you might be used to using. They all work here. And as I mentioned before, I think sending folks directly to sort of your landing page website is often the best bet for those kind of ads. And then finally, before kicking it back over to Michael, I just wanted to talk about success metrics. Make sure that you have this in place before you launch. Just kind of gauge what you think success is, and try to define it as granularly as possible. So a podcast industry term that is used a lot is a download. So that can mean an actual download, or it can actually mean a 1 minute or more stream. So they don't have to actually physically download it. They can stream it from their channel, and it's still called a download, just because, industry terms kind of perpetuate. But a branded podcast benchmark here is you're doing really well if you get 2,000 listens or downloads of your launch episode in the first month. That's just like an interesting thing to share if you were looking for benchmarks. A player stream is anytime someone hits play on the episode. Completion rate is a great way to measure, the rest are kind of a great way to measure like how how great your reach is and how kind of great you are at getting people to start. Completion rate obviously is great to see if you kind of are keeping people pulled in and listening for the majority of the episode. And then of course, subscribers and ratings are really important as well. So those are other things to measure. As far as how to measure, I think you can measure downloads or the rest of those sort of key terms either in your hosting software that I mentioned earlier, or through your partner if you're working with one. And then lastly, you can also use this as a way to see if you're shifting the way people are thinking about you, thinking about an issue, whatever it is, kind of whatever messaging you're hoping to achieve. You can measure that either through surveys, working with like a survey partner like a Millward Brown or existing ones that you might be working with already. Or you can kind of really scrappily put it together, create a Google form, make a short link for that. And then at the beginning of your podcast episode, say, hey, how's this sound to you? Like, give us a rating, go to this website. So there's, as I've mentioned throughout for almost every topic, there's like a really kind of expensive full service way to go. And there are really scrappy yet really polished feeling sort of options there kind of at the lower end of the budget. So it's really the world is your oyster, and it's really kind of about your passion and getting the word out there. So I'll kick it back over to Michael to kind of close us out with more Google Podcast details. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Tibby. So Tibby just shared a bunch of great info on how to think about getting started with your own podcast. And I wanted to just share a couple of resources as sort of a bookend to that that are from Google that I think would be particularly interesting to this audience. And then we're happy to take questions at the end. So if you have any of those, please feel free to comment them in, and we'll take them once we wrap. I mentioned Google Podcast Manager earlier in the call. This is the tool that we launched just yesterday. It's an analytics platform for podcast creators. And so what I would say with this is once you've created your show, or if you already have a show, Google Podcast Manager is really going to be your best friend to understand your listeners across Google Podcasts. And there's sort of two core functionality pieces to it. The first is you can use the tool to claim your podcast and then make sure that it's available on all Google products. And so that's Google Podcasts, but it's worth noting that Google Podcasts is available, as I said earlier, on Android, iPhones, the web, but you can also access it via the Google Assistant on devices like Google Home. And then the second functionality is to see analytics on your audience. And so this is everything from understanding at the show level, how many listens have there been over the last few weeks, how many minutes played, so how long have people listened to your show. But then you can also dig into specific episodes and actually see what we call an audience retention chart, which basically shows over the course of your episode where are listeners tuning in and where are they dropping off. And I think that can help you kind of determine, is my podcast too long? Are there certain segments that maybe aren't working where we see high drop off? But you can use it however you want. But I think we've seen in testing this that podcasters have found it really useful to sort of influence how they think about their content. And then finally, I mentioned that Google Podcast is available on a lot of different devices in a lot of different places. And so unique to this tool, you can actually see analytics that help you understand these different listening habits. So you can see what % of listeners are listening to your show on a smart speaker versus a mobile phone versus a desktop. And I think that's also really interesting and could potentially kind of influence how you think about your show and how you might tweak it if, for example, a lot of your listeners are tuning in on a smart speaker versus a phone. And then finally, I wanted to just put in a quick plug for the Podcasting 101 videos. This is a series of 10 videos that we have created with PRX as part of the creator program that I mentioned earlier. And these are really geared towards folks who are getting started with podcasting, really want to understand the basics from, when should I start a show? How do I think about growing my audience? A lot of the stuff that that Tibby talked through today. But I think it's just another sort of perspective and resource to help you understand more about podcasting. It's hosted by two sort of expert podcasters themselves who have really popular shows. And you can actually find this if you just go to YouTube and search for Podcasting 101. It should be the first result there. So with that, that's sort of the end of our scheduled programming. I wanted to invite Maria and Tibby back up, and we are happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Awesome. And thanks so much to both of you for presenting and teaching us all about podcasting. Like Michael said, if you guys have any questions, make sure to put them below, right in the platform right here, the blue button here. So the first question, Tibby, I'm going to look to you for this one. So I've heard so many times in podcasts, all the things that you laid out were super compelling of how do I create a podcast? Okay, well, now I have this podcast. How do I maintain the podcast? What are your best tips and tricks for, you get that initial launch, it's going pretty well, but at a certain level, you might fizzle out. So how do you actually maintain the podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's super relevant because I do think that sometimes people will see starting a podcast as that, we've heard it referred to as like shiny object syndrome. Like they'll be like, ooh, a podcast, that's an idea. And maybe they'll start it and kind of not do much with it from there. I think it all starts with kind of how you want to plan the podcast for whatever initiative you're working on. So for us, we did one season and our season had 5 episodes, and we will likely do a season 2 a little bit later. And so some podcasts do things like that. Other podcasts release every week, week over week for the entire year. And a lot of podcasts will actually record several at once and run and never take a week off, including holidays. So I would say the first answer to your question is just see which one of those things you want to do. And I would actually probably caution to go the season 1 route, just to kind of whet your appetite and see where the success can go. And then that way it doesn't feel as daunting because you can just plan season 2 in its finite way. And then it won't feel like, man, we have to come up with something week after week after week. And then another example is, use your audience. User-generated ideas is it's twofold. It gives you ideas, but it also makes your audience feel like they're being listened to and like it's an interactive experience. So, I mentioned you can put a URL in your pre or mid-roll to say kind of how am I doing? Do you like this podcast? Maybe you also add a question on there and what do you want to hear? And then maybe that can be a great springboard for future episodes.
Absolutely. I think it's really important, especially in the political context. Things are always changing for us. Things are happening, all that kind of stuff. So really making sure that you have all your ducks in a row and can actually maintain the podcast is something that's really, really important.
Yes.
Awesome. So I see a question here from Courtney. Courtney asks, is there a Google Podcast Manager? Is it able to track analytics on all platforms? Meaning, does it track downloads just from Google Podcasts, or would it track downloads from Spotify, SoundCloud, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Google Podcast Manager tracks listens on Google Podcasts. So as I said, Google Podcasts can be listened to on your iOS app, on an Android app, or on the web, or on the Assistant. But it's really focused on just Google Podcast listeners. So it won't capture things like Spotify, SoundCloud, other platforms. And this is a question that we get a lot because the audio and podcasting analytics space right now is fairly fragmented. And so from the perspective of a podcast creator, it can kind of be frustrating, right? Because you have Google Podcast Manager, so you can understand your listeners there. Spotify has their own sort of equivalent tool. Apple has their own. And so there are several different places that podcast creators often go to kind of get the full picture of their audience. And what I would say is that a lot of these analytics tools offer sort of similar functionality. I think the thing that's particularly unique about the Podcast Manager tool is it does give you that device breakdown. So it allows you to understand, are your listeners listening on smart speakers or phones or desktop? And we just launched yesterday, so we're super excited. And so far so good. Things have been going really well. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback. But definitely, for folks who sign up and start using the tool, we always welcome feedback on sort of how to make improvements. And so there's a way to kind of submit that through the tool. So definitely welcome any thoughts that people have.
Absolutely. And it's really helpful to be able to track that measurement, not only on, Google podcasting, but also on all the other Google tools that you might use, YouTube Analytics, Google Analytics. All of these features allow you a glimpse into your audience. So very worthwhile to plug into. I see another question here from Elisa. Will you be sharing this presentation for reference? So if you'd like us to share the presentation, make sure to email civics-outreach@google.com, and we'd be happy to share it with you. All right, let's see if I have any more questions here. One other question, thinking about, a lot of political folks, we have one principal in our organizations, one senator, one congressman, one head of our organization. What are some best practices that, folks can tap into maybe for that one person type of podcast? They might have on some listeners and things like that, but really the star of the show is that one principal.
Yeah, I mean, Tibby, I'm interested in your thoughts, having gone through this with Think with Google. I think one thing I'll jump in and share is I think it's really important to think about sort of what is the unique, in the business world we would call differentiator, but the thing that makes your principal special. And I think that we've seen a lot of the shows, particularly the shows that are built around a personality, that unique voice really shines through clearly in the podcast. If I think about, for sports fans out there, Bill Simmons, right? So he's one of the most popular podcasters, and love him or hate him, he has a very unique and distinct voice that he kind of communicates every time, whether it's just him talking or whether he's interviewing in conversation with people. You kind of have, like, when you turn it on and okay, yeah, this is a Bill Simmons podcast. He's bringing something unique to the table. And so I think that's like one of the earliest questions that I would think about as you're going through the process of like, should I launch a podcast or how do I improve my podcast today, is to think about, if it really is focused on one principle, what is the unique voice, the unique aspect of that person's personality that you really want to shine through, and then kind of structure the show around that. Right? Like there's different ways to accentuate different elements of someone's personality to kind of make that shine through. Yeah,
I mean, echo all of that. And I would actually say almost like contrary to maybe your instincts, in some ways, if your podcast is really just about one person or one singular thing, that's almost even better. Because I think the number one podcasts out there have a strong point of view. They have a really strong sense of brand and sort of singular theme. And I think, the possibilities are endless once you anchor the show in that. So if it's like a particular politician, I think that it would be an endless array of episode opportunities to explore how they think about any number of issues. I feel like you probably wouldn't even run out of kind of different parts of the platform to speak on, for example. But then it could also be like, let's do an episode about their childhood or their experience running a small business. Or, I think that you can kind of endlessly mine that sort of singularity for sort of different parts to the personality or parts to the issue if you're anchoring it on an issue. If anything, that's a gift you've been given, because it'll give your podcast an immediate sense of identity, and it'll give your listeners a hook to latch onto very early.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that I totally agree with Tibby that sometimes when you're launching a podcast, your intuition is to boil the ocean and how can we appeal to as many people and make this, as broad of a potential audience as we can. And I think a lot of folks that go in that direction kind of end up with something that doesn't really appeal to anyone. And so if you think about the question of like, how do I create a show that like, 1,000 of my constituents will love? That's oftentimes like a good sort of starting point. And will oftentimes lead you in the direction of creating something, to Tibby's point, that is really unique and singular. And I think a lot of times you'll find that that actually has broader appeal than if you take sort of a more generic approach.
Absolutely. No, that's super helpful. Well, I don't see any more questions here, but if folks do have any additional questions, feel free to email civics-outreach@google.com. If you missed any part of today's webinar or any webinars that we've done previously, feel free to watch them right here on demand, right below. You can also tune in for our future webinars. We'll have one next week, Monday, on YouTube production. So some of the things that you learned here about podcasting, you can also learn about some of that equipment and things of that nature on Monday at 2 p.m., Monday the 11th. And then the following Monday on the 18th, we are going to host another webinar about how you can do town halls and live streams for your audience. So make sure to tune into those or right here on demand. But thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to Michael and Tibby for really shepherding us through the podcasting process. I know I'm inspired and I hope you are too. So thanks so much and we'll see you guys soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.